This is the story of Earthworm Jim video game. In outer space, a sweet evil cyborg lost a Queen cyberspace suit while it smooshes.
But if that doesn't stop him, maybe the battle with Queen festering sweaty slug for a butt will. Earthworm Jim from Playmate.
The run-and-gun game genre evolved during the 16-bit era of console gaming. It is characterized by fast-paced gameplay, shooting mechanics, as well as adding in platforming elements. These are the games that typically involve controlling a character who runs, jumps, and shoots their way through levels filled with enemies and obstacles, and sometimes but not always ending with some sort of boss battle. These games often feature a side-scrolling perspective with players going from left to right while engaging in intense combat, but sometimes you can have a top-down view as well, offering more freedom of movement. These games are known for their challenging gameplay, adding in cooperative multiplayer options, and exciting action sequences that provided hours of adrenaline-pumping fun for players back in the day. While this genre had varying popularity in the United States, there are some games that fared a lot better in Japan, and hence why I own the Super Famicom version of some of these games, rather than the North American version. The most notable example of this will be the Mega Man series, known as Rockman in Japan, but since these also released in North America, I will be including them in this review. Let's go ahead and take a look at a few of the popular run-and-guns on the Super Nintendo. Personally, my first experience with this genre on the Super Nintendo was with Contra III: The Alien Wars. We owned Super C back on the Nintendo Entertainment System, but actually I hadn't played the first Contra before playing this game. Super C had provided hours of fun, even though I was hardly ever able to beat the game, especially without the help of my older brothers. But the atmosphere created by the game's graphics and sound, as well as the tough-as-nails gameplay, kept me coming back for more. And this is cranked up even farther in Contra III: The Alien Wars. This game puts players in the shoes of the tough-as-nails soldiers that are tasked with saving Earth from an alien invasion. To do this, you'll have to battle your way through a series of levels, which you can do single or multiplayer. The multiplayer experience is one I would recommend in this game, and you'll utilize various weapons and power-ups to defeat hordes of enemies and massive bosses. As with every Contra game, the first level is the one I am most familiar with because once you run out of continues, you're sent back to the very beginning. Personally, I find it hard to believe I used to be able to beat this game on hard difficulty, as I even seem to struggle with it on easy right now. But this game was an appropriate introduction to this genre for me as a kid, so I thought I would start out this review with this game as well. A couple of things that are thrown at you that are different for previous entries is the fact that you can destroy parts of the environment, as well as operate certain vehicles throughout the map. The visuals of this game are above and beyond what I expected for the Super Nintendo. The graphics are highly detailed, and they really went for that wow factor in a couple places to make this a unique experience. The soundtrack is one that can get stuck in your head, and I definitely recommend blaring it as you're playing through the game, as it really gives you that sense of an early 90s action movie kind of feel. And in the later levels, it really gets your blood pumping as you feel the desperation of trying to get through the final gauntlet. Although the gameplay is very challenging, especially on the higher difficulties, I would say that this one is a tough but fair kind of game. But I do want to point out that I feel that new players may not be as forgiving with the unbearable difficulty this game can dish out at you at times. To me, that is part of the charm of these types of games, but this is coming after all the years that I've spent yelling at my console and throwing controllers trying to learn and master each of these games, and that time has long since passed, so maybe I'm too far removed from it to have an accurate perspective. However, even considering that, I would recommend this as a game that if you have a Super Nintendo, could be an essential for your collection, especially if you love this genre. Earthworm Jim was originally released on the Sega Genesis, but a version for the Super Nintendo was released shortly after, and is largely the same as the Genesis version. However, this version has altered graphics, alternate backgrounds, and special effects, but differed in the fact that they lacked some of the sound effects from the original Genesis version, as well as a few alterations to the game's content, and they axed a level. What remains, however, is the comedic and offbeat platformer game that people will be familiar with. I decided to include this in with the run-and-gun shooters because that is essentially what a lot of the platforming in this game involves. In this game, you will take control of the title character, Jim, who is an ordinary earthworm that is turned into a superhero. The game's story is meant to poke fun at all of the other platformers that were being released in which you have to rescue a princess, so in this game you embark on a mission to rescue Princess What's-Her-Name from the evil clutches of the Queen, pulsing, bloated, festering, sweating, pus-filled, malformed slug for a butt. If you look very closely at that name, you'll notice that they embedded a subtle amount of 90s gross-out humor. As you work your way through a series of bizarre and imaginative levels, players must navigate Jim through platforming challenges, combat enemies, and engage in humorous interactions. The game's graphics are meant to give the appearance of a Saturday morning cartoon of the early 90s, as the developers that made this game really wanted to come up with that animation and art style that people were used to seeing in cartoons and translate it directly into a video game. And looking at the results, I have to say, mission accomplished. This game was not one that I owned back in the day, as the majority of my games were ones that I would have rented from my local video game store, but this one was a constant rental. And while this performs very admirably on the Super Nintendo, this is a game series I more closely associate with the Sega Genesis. So to be quite honest, I don't have a lot of experience with playing the Super Nintendo version. However, I did play through as far as I could get through this game, as it does get very frustratingly tedious towards the end. And I have to say, I was able to relive my childhood nostalgia of this game all over again. Overall, I give this game about an 8 out of 10, recommending it to most players on this system. With the success of Earthworm Jim, a sequel seemed to be inevitable. And while some sequels were apt to disappoint during this time period, I'm happy to say Earthworm Jim 2 definitely continues the offbeat and comedic platforming adventures of Earthworm Jim, and gets it right. This game builds on the foundation of its predecessor, with more refined gameplay mechanics and even more imaginative level designs. The addition of new abilities and challenges keeps the experience fresh and exciting. However, some players may find the higher difficulty in this game to be a bit of a turnoff, and it can lead to a lot of frustration, even more so than the first game. But again, having a tough but fair difficulty allows me to keep coming back to this game without getting too frustrated with it. Except for that level where you have to make a balloon go across the map, I wouldn't be sad if they got rid of that level. Another thing about this game that keeps me coming back to it is the humor in this game. They seem to double down in the absurdity. With Jim's witty dialogue, some of the bizarre scenarios you find yourself in, and the humorous enemy designs create a constant sense of joy and maintain the lighthearted tone of the series. And in regards to this game's soundtrack, two of my favorite video game themes from all time are in this game. So with that in mind, I'm going to rate this game just slightly higher than the original at 8.5 out of 10, again recommending it to most players on the Super Nintendo.
Well. Well.
The early 90s also gave rise to the first-person shooter genre, and one of the most iconic titles that kickstarted this genre into high gear was Wolfenstein 3D. In this game, you take control of the Allied spy, William B.J. Blazkowicz, as he infiltrates Nazi strongholds, battles enemies, and uncovers secrets in a series of maze-like levels. Again, this game features you in a first-person perspective as you hunt around rooms looking for treasures, power-ups, weapons, and keys that will allow you to progress through the level and battle different enemies. And although this game is not as visually impressive as it was on PCs at the time, the fact that they got this to run on the Super Nintendo is an impressive feat in and of itself, when you consider the limitations of the Super Nintendo compared to gaming PCs at the time. The game's sprites are recognizable, and the game maintains the dark and gritty atmosphere of Nazi-infested environments. However, the game's graphics are noticeably simplified when you compare it to the PC version, with fewer textures and less detail. There were several times where you notice enemies off in the distance, but you can't really tell what they are, you just shoot at them, and it's only when you get up close to them where you can finally kind of make out who they're supposed to be. The controls adapted for the Super Nintendo's gamepad are not as precise as those of the PC version either. The limited buttons and lack of mouse support make aiming a lot less smooth, as well as turning. But, considering back at the time, my family didn't own a PC and this is the only way I could play this game, I found this perfectly acceptable back in the day. The cost of buying a Super Nintendo and a cartridge for Wolfenstein 3D was significantly less than the investment needed to get a PC running with the same game. Nowadays, going back to this version doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you're just trying to experience it on the Super Nintendo, considering that the PC version is now much more accessible. Another notable difference between this and the PC version is the absence of certain levels and the removal of Nazi symbols due to censorship rules. Nevertheless, though, this was an iconic title to port to the Super Nintendo and get it running on this hardware, and I'd give it around a 7 out of 10. Even noting the limitations that this game has, it still is fun to go back and play it, but may not be the preferred option for everyone.
Halt! Ah! Stop! Ah! Stop! Stop! Halt! Ah!
Doom was its enormously successful follow-up to Wolfenstein 3D. This game broke through a lot of the limitations the original game engine had, allowing players to actually navigate up and down, not just across the screen, and they expanded upon the visuals that were used in the game. Doom became an overnight success and was quickly available on almost every PC being sold at the time, and I remember my first experience playing this game being at a Walmart where they had a kiosk set up for kids to come up and try Doom. This was the only way I knew I'd be able to play it because I definitely was not expecting a version to be ported to the Super Nintendo. But sure enough, another miracle happened as Doom was ported to the Super Nintendo. This game puts you in the shoes of a lone Marine who battles through hordes of demonic creatures unleashed on a Martian research facility, and just like in Wolfenstein 3D before it, you'll battle through different maze-like levels, get an arsenal of weapons, and collect keys and power-ups, all while defeating enemies until you reach the level's end goal. And even though they ended up using the Super FX chip to make this port even possible on the Super Nintendo, the fact that they were able to get it to run on this cartridge with the Super FX chip was again another incredible feat. As expected though, everything had to be scaled down due to the hardware limitations, especially memory inside of a cartridge. And as a result, everything looks a lot lower in resolution, and everything looks a lot more chunky and pixely. However, the levels and enemies are both recognizable for what they should be, and while it's all simplified in appearance, everything is still just as menacing as in the PC version. As expected, the awkward turning and aiming system is back from Wolfenstein 3D, which can make parts of the game seem a bit more tedious than it really should be. And again, there is some content missing in this game because of the limitations of the Super Nintendo. One of the most notable differences was the lack of any sort of multiplayer, which I assume that was seen as an impossibility at the time given the Super Nintendo's weaker performance than a PC. And just like Wolfenstein 3D, this port doesn't seem to make as much sense today to play as it did back in the day when most people still didn't have gaming PCs. But if you're looking for a way to experience Doom on your Super Nintendo, this is it, and I would give it around a 6.5 out of 10, slightly downgraded from the Wolfenstein 3D port. Again, just recommending it to players that want to try this out and see what it was like, because it is much more accessible on other platforms today. Mega Man X was an exclusive for the Super Nintendo, and this game revitalized the Mega Man franchise with a new protagonist and enhanced gameplay mechanics. This was the first game that offered the core elements of a Mega Man game on the Super Nintendo, and it was only released weeks after Mega Man VI on the NES. In this game, you take control of the robotic hero X as he battles against the rogue Reploid army led by the villainous Sigma. With his trusty X-Buster arm cannon and an array of powerful upgrades, X navigates through a series of challenging levels, defeating powerful bosses known as Mavericks, and this game features tight platforming, precise shooting, and the ability to acquire new weapons and armor upgrades that the series is known for. And again, this game was another constant weekend rental for me. This game has tight and responsive gameplay, capturing the essence of the classic Mega Man formula while introducing new elements, such as X's ability to dash and wall jump, which allows you to add more strategy to how you attack each level's platforming sequences. As expected, defeating boss enemies at the end of each level gives you new weapons, which also in turn give you new abilities in how you attack the next level. The bosses in this game are also a real highlight. Each Maverick boss has a unique ability and pattern, requiring careful observation and quick reflexes to defeat. As expected from the Mega Man franchise, the game's soundtrack is exceptional, featuring energetic and memorable tunes that complement the action and add to the overall atmosphere. And while I'm a bit more partial to the soundtracks on the NES's sound chip, this soundtrack is no slouch and is one I definitely didn't mind cranking up the volume to when I was younger, and still every once in a while like to revisit. But also, I shouldn't overlook the sound effects in this game, as they also get a much-needed upgrade over the NES, providing very satisfying sounds from when you shoot, hit, and defeat enemies. The graphical style of this game also gets a much-needed upgrade from the NES, and it looks fantastic. The only minor criticism I have of this game is the game's difficulty level, which is especially challenging for newcomers to this series. Some of these sections require precise timing and very quick reflexes, leading to a lot of frustration. But with a tough but fair mentality, the sense of accomplishment upon overcoming these challenges is highly satisfying. Overall, I'd give this game a 9 out of 10, recommending it to most to collect for their system. Keeping with tradition of the previous Mega Man game, this game did spawn further sequels, Mega Man X2 and Mega Man X3, but you'll notice that my games are called Rockman X2 and Rockman X3. That is because these are the Super Famicom versions, and in Japan, Mega Man is known as Rockman. And the reason why I have the Super Famicom versions and not the ones for North America is the fact that the price tag for a physical copy of X2 and X3 are almost exponentially higher. Mega Man X2 builds upon the foundations of the first game, offering more of the same exhilarating action and platforming gameplay, with the graphics maintaining the high standards set by the original, with detailed sprites and vibrant environments. Again, you have to make your way through a series of challenging levels, defeat the Mavericks, and this time uncover a truth behind an emerging threat. Again, this is another title that knocks it out of the park, and I would definitely recommend it, but a physical copy may be best on the Super Famicom, or just pick up the Mega Man X collection. Overall, I'd give X2 about an 8.5 out of 10. In Mega Man X3, there is yet another threat from a group of Mavericks that attempt to resurrect the fallen Sigma, and this game introduces new gameplay elements, such as the ability to play as Zero, X's ally, as well as the addition of chip upgrades that enhance X's abilities. Again, the game's graphics and the soundtrack are very much on point, making X3 a very worthy addition to this series. Adding in the new gameplay elements keeps the gameplay from getting too stale, but overall I would say by the time I got through this third entry, I was getting a bit of franchise fatigue, and I give this one about an 8 out of 10 overall. But again, due to the high price point, or the fact that you'd have to import it from Japan, I would only recommend collecting a physical copy to hardcore collectors. However, for those of you that long for the more classic adventures of Mega Man on the NES, never fear because there is Mega Man VII. In this game, you once again take control of Mega Man as he faces off against his arch-nemesis, Dr. Wily, who has unleashed a new army of robot masters. The game follows the same familiar formula from the previous entries in the series, with players navigating through themed levels, defeating bosses, and acquiring their weapons. Again, Mega Man must stop Dr. Wily's nefarious plans and save the world, or die trying. Mega Man VII retains the core gameplay mechanics of the classic Mega Man series, but upgrades it with 16-bit visuals and sound. The visuals stray away from the futuristic designs of Mega Man X and returns to a more classic art style of the previous Mega Man series. The gameplay remains faithful to the roots of the series, providing platforming challenges and precise controls. Mega Man can slide, charge his arm cannon, and utilize special weapons acquired by defeated bosses. One notable change in Mega Man VII is the introduction of the auto charge feature, which will automatically charge Mega Man's arm cannon after a brief period of not shooting. The soundtrack again features a mix of catchy tunes and atmospheric tracks that showcase memorable melodies with energetic beats. When comparing this to the Mega Man X series on the Super Nintendo, Mega Man VII retains the traditional 2D platforming and level design of the previous entries in the series, and this game removes the ability to dash or wall jump, as well as removing the darker storyline that was in Mega Man X. Overall, I give this game about an 8 out of 10, but continuing on with the recurring theme, I'm only going to recommend this to hardcore collectors due to the game's high price to collect it physically here in North America. Well, would you look at the time? Looks like we're gonna have to split off the rest of these games into another part of the Ultimate Super Nintendo review. But for the ones I've covered in this video, which ones have you played, and did I cover any of your favorites yet? And also be sure to let me know which games absolutely have to be covered as run-and guns on the Super Nintendo, and I'll make sure I include those in part 2. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.